Uh, I hope this is probably like 17 or 18 minutes. So if you want to get up and walk around or something like that, you want to stretch. It's called The Armoire. Before Sarah Edelstein went to the vaudeville extravaganza at the Second Avenue Theater, she told a small white lie that she was going to the library with her best friend, Frederica. Frederica told her mother they were going to the library also. They skipped along up Christie Street, avoiding carts overloaded with vegetables and goods for sale, crossed Houston, and then walked up Second Avenue, giggling. They had grown up in the same block of Stanton Street, and the neighborhood had taken to calling them the twins, because if you saw one, you could bet a nickel that the other wasn't far behind. At 11 years old, they were just old enough to get into trouble. Sarah had flaming red hair, hazel eyes, and an endless supply of freckles. Frederica, on the other hand, had black hair, dark brown eyes, and the most angular cheekbones on the Lower East Side. The ticket taker took their money, and they entered the cavernous theater. It was crowded, and the heat from 500 people was welcoming on a cold, blustery Sunday. They found seats in the 5th row and watched as little Celia Adler played a scene from Der Jiddischer König Lear. Sarah was spellbound and wondered what it would have been like to be born into a theatrical family like Celia and play different roles instead of helping her mother iron. The crowd loved the young actress on stage and clapped vigorously as she curtsied at the end of her scene. Sarah and Frederica both put their feet on the back of the seats in front of them and hunkered down, eating the lemon drops Frederica brought in a brown paper bag. The floor was sticky, the air was stuffy, but still Sarah felt like she was in heaven. Sarah whispered, wondering what the next act would be, while Frederica told her to be quiet. An accordionist and a violinist on the side of the stage played a few bars of music, while a tall bear of a man with wavy brown hair and a waxed mustache and a buxom woman with jet black hair in a maroon dress entered on stage. The man labored with a dolly that held a large mahogany armoire, whose dark grain he lovingly oiled on the last Friday morning of each month. He set the armoire down on the stage without removing the dolly from underneath it, and opened the door so that the audience could see there was nothing inside. Not even the teeniest creak issued forth from the painstakingly oiled hinges. He then turned the armoire around, using the dolly, to show the audience that the back was solid and there was no secret door. He maneuvered the armoire again so that it faced forward, then gingerly he lifted one end of the armoire while he slid the dolly out from under that massive wooden cabinet and ceremoniously wheeled it off stage, as if it were a dance partner he was happy to be rid of. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am the great Smolensky, and this is my able colleague, Miss Lena," the broad, tall man said, puffing out his barreled chest and indicating Miss Lena with a flourish of his white-gloved hand. Miss Lena, whose cleavage knew no bounds, curtsied and looked bored. "We are thrilled to be here at the Second Avenue Theater and want to thank Mr. David Kessler for booking us, along with all the other great acts today. Mr. Kessler, we promise not to make you disappear," the great Smolensky said with a smile. "Just start the act," a man in a row behind Sarah and Frederica yelled. "You want we should step outside?" the great Smolensky said, flexing his bicep and laughing in the direction of the man behind Sarah. "Well, if you have nothing left to say, then schweig." The great Smolensky strode back across the stage and stood next to Miss Lena, who batted her eyes at him. He puffed out his chest and said, "We will use our magical armoire to make Miss Lena disappear. May I have a volunteer from the audience to examine the armoire?" Sarah and Frederica, who had done everything together since they were 3, both raised their hands, waving them eagerly, as if the lives of all 500 people in the theater depended on how vigorously they stretched their fingers into the air. "Ah, I see we have some eager young assistants here," said the great Smolensky, as he fingered one end of his heavily waxed mustache, twisting the ends upward unconsciously, unaware that he was preening in public. "Come on up, young ladies." Sarah and Frederica ran up the stairs of the stage. Sarah looked straight at the great Smolensky, ignoring the bright lights and eagerly waiting instructions from his full lips, which were partially covered by his carefully trimmed mustache. Frederica also scrambled up the stairs, but as soon as her face was bathed in the hot light of the spot, it became hard for her to listen to the sonorous voice of the great Smolensky. "Now, young ladies, take a look inside the armoire and let the audience know if there's anything unusual about it." Sarah pulled on the burnished brass handle of the old armoire, and it opened with an almost imperceptible creak, which made the great Smolensky pause his shtick momentarily and make a mental note to oil the hinges at the end of the night. She peered inside, and then Frederica joined her in thumping gently on the wood, which made the great Smolenski cringe each time one of their small hands thwacked the wood, making a sound like a drum. Miss Lena watched them with a smile, amused by their wide-open stares, their braids, and their almost flat chests. "Do you see anything unusual or any other door besides the front door?" asked the great Smolenski. "No," said Sarah with a strong voice. "No," whispered Frederica. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we will have Miss Lena enter the armoire, and when I count to 7, she will be gone. Miss Lena?" Miss Lena sauntered over to the armoire, first shaking hands daintily with Sarah and Frederica, and then climbed into the dark interior of the mahogany cabinet. Miss Lena, who had had a few run-ins with the law, mostly in the form of Officer Patrick O'Leary, a massive, craggy-headed Irishman with a penchant for Zoftig women, who had arrested her more than once just so that he could help her in and out of the paddy wagon, half hoped that this would be the day that the great Smolenski's magic would work. "And now," the great Smolenski said with a flourish of his hand, "I will ask you all to count to 7 with me, and then we shall see if Miss Lena is still there." The great Smolenski beckoned to the audience to count with him, his voice getting louder with each number, and his arms waving. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and now, my fine Maedelas, open the door. Sarah and Frederica approached the armoire, holding hands tightly before Sarah reached for the brass door handle. She opened the door with a firm tug, and she and Frederica both shrieked, as only young girls can shriek, when they discovered it was empty. The audience thundered, and the great Smolenski bowed as he escorted them off the stage with a flourish, and went to fetch his dolly to cart the armoire away. "I wonder if he could make my landlord disappear," Sarah said quietly to Frederica, as they settled back into their wooden seats. "What a great idea," Frederica said, sitting up and rubbing her nose, which she did when she got excited. "He keeps trying to corner Mama when he comes for the rent," Sarah said. "That's disgusting," said Frederica. "But Smolenski's just an act. You don't really think he makes people disappear, do you?" Sarah thought about how anxious her mother got each month before the landlord, Mr. Thornton, came, and how much she loved her Mama and wanted to protect her. She grabbed Frederica's hand in hers and said, "Ricky, we're going to find out." Sarah and Frederica waited outside the stage door of the theater after the show for the great Smolenski, and when they saw him, they ran up to him at a speed that alarmed the big debonair man. "Mr. Smolenski, I have a question," Sarah asked. "Ah, my little Fagala, what is your question?" asked this great Smolenski. "Can you make anyone disappear?" "Anyone who will go into the armoire," the great Smolenski answered. Why would a sweet teckle like you, who would a sweet teckle like you want to be rid of?" "The landlord," said Sarah quietly, as she used the toe of one of her saddle shoes to scratch an itch on her opposite leg. "When does the landlord come to your house?" the great Smolenski asked. "On the 1st of the month. The whole week before, my mother washes sheets for anyone who will pay her, and mends the clothes of anyone who is working and doesn't have a good sewer in the house, until she has the money for the rent." "And your papa?" "Her papa is dead," said Frederica, with what she hoped was an appropriately grave face. "And where do you live?" asked the great Smolenski wearily. "If you live higher than the 1st floor, I cannot help you, because it is too hard to get the armoire up a narrow stairwell." Sarah clapped her hands gleefully. "We live on the 1st floor at 145 Stanton Street, apartment 1D. Will you help us?" The great Smolenski gazed into the future in the form of Sarah's hazel green eyes, and knew that he was not likely to decline her request. But he was tired and had been called upon to disappear a few people that week, including a 17-year-old who had lost track of her cycle and was now pregnant. The young woman had pled with the great Smolenski, who had argued that her parents would be bereft if he transported her out of state, but he relented when she cried and said her tata and mama would sit shiva for her when they found out she had a little mamzer in the oven. The great Smolenski looked down at Sarah distractedly. He was tired, and all he wanted was a glass of Slivovitz and a hot bath. "Ach, I'm tired, and I can't help everyone who comes to me with their tale of woe," the great Smolenski said. Sarah's face flushed red with anger, almost as red as her hair. She opened her mouth to say a bad word, but then held her tongue, because if she called him the name in her mind, she knew he wouldn't help her. But it was serious little Frederica, whose dark eyes looked impossibly sunken in her face because of her high cheekbones, who pinned the great Smolenski to his moral fiber with her piercing stare and left him with an image of a family dispossessed. He pictured them sitting upon their bundles and schmatas on the sidewalk, waiting for some obligated but resentful cousin to show up with a horse and carriage to haul them away. Probably to a coal-dusted room that they would share with 2 spinster aunts and a Romanian seamstress boarder who snored like a leaky boiler. The great Smolenski turned on his heel, hoping that a few glasses of Slivovitz would make him forget Frederica's dark pupils and the heavy burdens of the greeners, who were often taken advantage of by greedy landlords and sometimes ribono shelalam even by their own people. Sarah, who did not often cry, had to bite her lip to keep her tears from falling, and wrapped her green wool scarf tightly around her neck, as if that would help keep her emotions contained. Sarah watched the great back of the vaudevillian grow smaller as he walked away from them. Frederica put her arm around Sarah, and they walked slowly down 2nd Avenue, wishing they had the money to buy a knish. The next day, Frederica showed up at Sarah's apartment with a foxy grandpa marshmallow candy and a look of determination. "We will go back every day until he agrees to help us," she said. Sarah nodded, and the girls traded a pinky swear under the watchful eyes of Sarah's mother, who wondered what no good they were up to. That afternoon, they skipped up 2nd Avenue past Mr. Ginniger's dry goods store, where Sarah was not welcome after she once came with a bottle to buy kerosene, but got confused because Mr. Ginniger's name rhymed with vinegar, and she had dipped her bottle with some kerosene still in the bottom of it into a barrel of vinegar, thereby causing Mr. Ginniger to disinvite her from ever entering the store again. Every day for a week, the 2 girls went to the 2nd Avenue Theater and lurked near the stage door, and every day they were told by the janitor that the great Smolenski had the flu and was not there that day. The janitor, a tall man with side curls and a permanent leer, asked them if he could help them with something, and Frederica, not liking the tone of his voice, had grabbed Sarah by the hand, and they had crossed the street without so much as saying goodbye. But on Sunday, they rounded the corner and walked smack into the barrel chest of the great Smolenski, who laughed a deep rumbling laugh, fed by the bellows of his enormous lungs. After having had his torpor and his impatience licked clean by a week's worth of fever, he looked down at the girls, who did not look alike, but who stood on their right hips with their left arms akimbo in the exact same way. Sarah drew herself up to her height of 4 feet 10 inches and said, "We have come again to ask you to help us get rid of our landlord. Please, Mr. Smolenski, please." "It is the great Smolenski," Smolenski said jokingly. "Please, Mr. Great Smolenski, will you help us?" Sarah asked. "What has the landlord done that's so bad?" the great Smolenski asked. Not that he believed blood-sucking landlords had to do anything in particular to warrant the loathing of those who paid outrageous rents. He laughed, thinking to himself that it was like asking what a bedbug had done. Sarah looked down at her scuffed shoes. She didn't know how much she could trust the great Smolenski. After all, he was a man, and she had been told by her mother and aunts never to trust strange men. Before she could answer, Frederica piped up. He said that Sarah's mother could pay him another way. Frederica paused for dramatic effect, and it wasn't washing or ironing. The great Smolenski felt a deep anger welling up in him. It rose from the tips of his toes and climbed up his calves and into his thighs, which were like small tree trunks, and into his chest. It grabbed him by his kishkas and made them royal, then rose into his chest and lungs and down his long muscle-bound arms until it lodged in his clenched fist, where he squeezed it tight like a chicken whose neck he could snap in seconds with his long, thick fingers. The great Smolenski looked down at Sarah and Frederica. His response was a promise, forged by his anger and his hatred for men who took advantage of women. "I will do my best to help you." Sarah hugged the great Smolenski, baring her nose and hiding her tears in his thick wool coat that smelled of chestnuts and tobacco. Frederica took out a pencil and wrote Sarah's address on a piece of a brown paper bag and gave it to the great Smolenski, who folded it carefully and put it in the inside breast pocket of his coat. True to his word, the great Smolenski showed up 2 days later with his brother, an enormous man named Leon the Starker, who also sported a wax mustache, even longer and curlier than his brother's. Leon helped him wrestle the armoire up to the top of the stoop and along the hallway of the first floor, while saying a few choice words that added considerably to the girl's vocabulary. Sarah had told her mother about the great Smolenski a few days earlier, and her mother, Luba Edelstein, had yelled at her for lying about going to the 2nd Avenue Theater instead of the library. "You know what happens to girls who lie to their mothers?" Luba had asked, while grabbing a hold of Sarah's shoulders and shaking her. Sarah's eyes flew open wide because her mother was usually calmer and mild-mannered. "First, they get a good potch," Luba said, raising her hand to make a point, "and then bad things can happen to them. I don't want you to talk to strangers, and especially not to strange men. You're not a little girl anymore." "But Mama," Sarah had protested, "it's not a strange man. It's the great Smolenski. He can make bad people disappear." Smolensky, Polensky, I don't care if he's famous or not. I don't want you talking to anyone you don't know. You tell Frederica that I'll tell her mama too if I catch you girls running around like wild animals, and then she won't be able to sit down for a week. Sarah had wriggled away from her mother, who kept trying to read her face like it was a strip in the funnies that she didn't quite understand. But when the great Smolensky knocked at their door the following Sunday and said to a surprised Mrs. Edelstein, "Madam, God has sent me and my brother Leon to rid you of your evil landlord," Sarah's mother did not shut the door in their faces, but allowed them to come in. The great Smolensky and Leon the Starker huffed and puffed and placed the armoire in the corner of the living room, which was clean and had polished rough wood floors that sloped so much that the armoire looked a little off-kilter. Mrs. Edelstein then went to put on a kettle for tea and returned to the living room to study the two brothers. "Madam, you must not let anyone else except the landlord go into the armoire. Tell him that you need help fixing the clothes rod inside," the great Smolensky cautioned her. Mrs. Edelstein, who was a good judge of people, felt her doubts soften in the face of the gravity of the great Smolensky's voice. She nodded her head in assent and handed the great Smolensky and his brother tea in her two best cups. The next week, which was the first of the month, the landlord, Joshua Thornton, came by at 9 a.m. like clockwork. He banged hard on the door, and Mrs. Edelstein opened it quickly. Frederica had come over earlier to see what she could see. "Ah, good day, Mrs. Edelstein," the unctuous Mr. Thornton said as he held out his hairy hand for her rent envelope. "Come in, Mr. Thornton, come in," Mrs. Edelstein said nervously. "I have to get my purse, but in the meantime, would you be kind enough to help me with the clothes rod in my armoire?" At that moment, Mrs. Fargetstein, their next-door neighbor, who had a knack for putting her nose in other people's business, dropped in to get a cup of sugar. She took one look at the armoire and said, "Oh, Luba, you got an armoire. How lovely. May I look inside?" as she strode toward the armoire without waiting for a reply. Mrs. Edelstein, moving fast for a woman of her bulk, jumped in front of the armoire and blocked Mrs. Fargetstein, planting herself like a tree before the armoire. "I was just getting help from Mr. Thornton. Come back later, Isa," Mrs. Edelstein said, trying to act nonchalant. Mrs. Fargetstein was a woman who was not easily deterred and could smell a ruse as well as she could smell a bad carp. She fainted left, but Mrs. Edelstein parried and would not let her near the armoire. Mrs. Fargetstein made a lunge for the armoire door and started to pull it open. She poked her head in, whereupon Sarah suddenly tugged on her skirt and shrieked, "I just saw a mouse," knowing that the only thing in the entire world that Mrs. Fargetstein was scared of were the cute little whiskered rodents that also called 145 Stanton Street home. Mrs. Fargetstein pulled her head back out of the armoire quicker than if it had been on fire, hiked up her skirt, and skittered out of the apartment, calling behind her, "Good day, Mr. Thornton. Luba, I'll come by later." "I will get the mouse man up here," Mr. Thornton mumbled. He seemed eager to change the subject. He looked at the floorboards to see if there were any mouse holes, and said, "Now about that clothes rod." Mr. Thornton was not one for helping anyone, but he was eager to avoid a conversation about mice, and in a good mood because it was rent day. Besides, if truth be told, he liked Sarah and her friend. Sarah had noticed that spittle gathered in the corners of his lips, and he flushed red and started to breathe heavily whenever she ran into him on the stairs. Mrs. Edelstein stepped away from the looming piece of furniture and opened the armoire, and Sarah and Frederica hovered behind her. Frederica started to shake in anticipation, and Sarah poked her in the ribs with her sharp elbow. "It's in the very back," Mrs. Edelstein said. "So nice of you to help." Mr. Thornton stepped into the armoire to feel for the clothes rod, and then Sarah and Frederica pushed the door behind him. Sarah started counting. 1, 2, 3. They heard the muffled cries of Mr. Thornton, who yelled angrily, "I am not here to play games," and banged on the door of the armoire. Mrs. Edelstein, Sarah, and Frederica all threw their weight against the armoire door, which bulged outward with each blow that Mr. Thornton landed on it from inside the dark interior. Sarah counted with her eyes shut. 4, 5, her voice getting louder. Her mother, terrified, had used one free hand to put her apron over her head, but Sarah could hear her counting quietly underneath it. 6, 7, Sarah and Frederica cried triumphantly, with Mrs. Edelstein's subdued voice like an echo. There was no sound from the armoire. Mrs. Edelstein, still with the great bulk of her weight leaning against the door, whispered, "Open your eyes." Sarah opened her eyes, and her mother removed the apron from her face. Frederica, usually the timid one, was so curious that she pushed them away, opened the door of the armoire, and poked her head in. "What do you see?" asked Mrs. Edelstein desperately. "Gornished," said Frederica with glee. "Gornished?" Mrs. Edelstein asked with disbelief. Sarah looked in, and there was nothing in the armoire. Next, Mrs. Edelstein looked in too, her heart pounding underneath her heavy bosom. Baruch Hashem, she said softly. I guess you don't have to pay them rent this month, Mama, said Sarah proudly. What do I do if the police come, whispered Mrs. Edelstein. Nothing, Frederica said. You do a beautiful nothing. Later that evening, the great Smolensky and his looming brother Leon arrived to haul the armoire down the stairs. They knocked respectfully on the old front door, which had already been painted so many times that it almost didn't close properly. How did it go, madam? Asked the great Smolensky. There is nothing to say, said Mrs. Edelstein with a smile. Mrs. Edelstein, who was not an effusive woman, hugged both the great Smolensky and his brother Leon and offered them some bread and kippered herring. She made Frederica and Sarah promise never to say a word to anyone about what had happened that day. Sarah was good at keeping secrets, but Frederica was organically indiscreet, like a bucket that didn't know it had a hole in itself. Rumors spread quicker than germs on the Lower East Side, and soon the great Smolensky and his armoire were in demand, as many people were eager to get rid of their evil landlords. The great Smolensky, whose given name was Yasha, and his brother Leon became a familiar sight on the crowded streets near the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge, carting their beautifully burnished armoire up and down the wide stoops of tenements, giving special discounts to widows. They worked steadily every month for several years until one day they felt the hot corned beef breath of the local police upon their necks, and they packed up and moved to St. Louis, where their youngest brother ran a theater. Mrs. Edelstein and her neighbors went rent-free for 2 years, which is how long it took for the landlord's family to fight over his estate after his disappearance, and the building was finally sold. Sarah and Frederica grew taller and wider in certain places, continued to lie about going to the library, and ran to the Second Avenue Theater whenever they had the chance. There they learned about anatomy from a narcoleptic fan dancer. Miss Lena, the great Smolensky's former assistant, and Mr. Thornton, the landlord, became an unlikely couple in Shanghai, where they found themselves in an old but clean hotel after awakening from a deep opium-induced sleep. Mr. Thornton thought about returning to New York, but between the soporific effects of the opium and Miss Lena's acumen as a contortionist, he decided to remain in Shanghai. Besides, the real estate business was the same all over the world. Mrs. Edelstein was able to save some money during the 2 years of free rent and invest in a good Singer sewing machine. She heard from Esther Margolis, who she ran into when she was getting groceries, that Esther's sister's rabbi's daughter had moved to St. Louis and reported there was a part of St. Louis where evil landlords were suddenly disappearing, and where a widow in need could find relief and assistance from 2 brothers sporting wax mustaches and an uncompromising sense of justice. You can't believe everything you hear, Mrs. Edelstein told Esther Margolis while they stood online at the butcher. Take it from me, landlords just don't disappear into nothing.